The Apollo moon landings. The lunar photographs, possible anomalies, inconsistencies, and unexplained details. And I pressed the wrong button. Okay, it's not going to happen again. But it's a very good device, this, if you press the right button. So, when Anthony said, come and talk to us about the moon landings, I thought, okay, the unexplained anomalies, the inconsistencies, is based on a talk I was asked to give at the British Interplanetary Society. I don't know if anybody here is a member of the British Interplanetary Society, which started in Liverpool in 1933 and is now based in London. It had some very famous people as members. Arthur C. Clarke was a leading light for many years. Patrick Moore was a leading light. And it's now in its 80th year, and they deal with space travel, as you would imagine. And they'd heard about all these anomalies that we were talking about. And I was invited to give a presentation there. And they said, just stick to the pictures, because when they invited me, it generated a lot of, should we say, heat on certain websites. Because how dare this venerable institution invite a hoax believer, that's what I am, I'm a hoax believer, in the moon landings. And I thought, okay, well, let's just put the evidence there and just see what happens. So I did a similar presentation to the one I'm going to do here, and we'll see what the end result was. Obviously, I was a little bit nervous about being in front of all these knowledgeable people who would understand if I was making a mistake and was saying things which weren't correct. But guess what? I didn't say things that weren't correct. I didn't make mistakes. All right, let's start with the camera. It's important to understand the camera. The Hasselblad camera, very, very good camera. The camera that would have been chosen, and down there, that is the camera you can go into a shop today and buy. The digital version of the Hasselblad camera costs about £25,000, so you can imagine how good it is, besides being very expensive. That is the adapted camera that was used allegedly on the moon. And up here, this is what it looked like. Now, when I say adapted, it was altered slightly. More than slightly, actually. The only automatic feature on the camera was the batteries that wound the film forward. You press the button, the film automatically winds forward. Most people are familiar with that as a camera. What you may not know is it had its viewfinder taken out, because if you're wearing a spacesuit, you can't use a viewfinder. On a Hasselblad, the viewfinder is on the top of the camera there, and you can't use it. So they took it away. So you've got to use this camera with no viewfinder. The shutter is this button here. And guess what? From a spacesuit, you can't actually see the shutter. There it is. So they put a pistol grip on it, which you can't see in a spacesuit either. But NASA tells us, and if you go onto their website, you'll see there are 32,000 photographs taken on the moon. In the camera, there is a glass plate. This is the camera. This is where the magazine, which is detachable from the camera, fixes on. And there was a glass plate fitted into the camera with 25 what are called reticules, little crosshairs. It was very technical about why they had to put it in, but in fact what it does is identify every photograph that was taken allegedly on the lunar surface. I've done several TV programs about this subject, and on one of them, the film company came along with a replica camera, which they borrowed from Hasselblad in London. So you can see it's very similar. I photographed this about 10 years ago. Notice here the batteries. These are the batteries that you operate the motor to wind the film forward. They're ordinary batteries. You can go into a shop and buy them today. They're D2 Varta batteries. We'll come on to the effect of the lunar surface on batteries later. This is the only visual image here on the side of the camera. There it is there. It's in large version there, which tells you if you've actually taken a picture. Because guess what? In space, no one can hear you scream. And also, no one can hear the camera go click, because there's no mirror to do that. That's what you hear, mirror going up. So there's no sound. You have no means of knowing if a photograph has been taken. And guess what? You can't see that dial. Okay, let's get to the moon. On the way to the moon, we have this iconic, there's a lot of iconic photographs here. Iconic because nobody's ever taken them again. This is the moon, we're told, and this is the Earth, we're told, pale blue dot. What's wrong with that picture? Okay, bit of mathematics needed here. You're orbiting the moon, and if you do, you'll be about 60 miles above the surface. Otherwise, you crash into the moon, or you fly off into space. You've got to be about 60 miles up. Now, if you're 60 miles above the lunar surface, how far away is the horizon? The answer is 250 miles. A bit of trigonometry will give you that answer. So if you're 250 miles away, and we're told that the highest mountain on the moon is about 3 miles above the lunar surface, how can you see it? It's far too far away. It's like standing here in Harrogate and seeing the Eiffel Tower in Paris, 250 odd miles away. Well, maybe a bit more. It's 250 miles from where I live, get up here. But 250 miles away, you wouldn't see the horizon in that detail. Now, when they were practicing to do the whole Apollo stuff, and by the way, there's a point about this. In 1958, America set up NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, October 1958, in direct response to the launch of Sputnik earlier that year, early in 1957, by Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was then. NASA then instituted the Mercury program, that's one man in a capsule orbiting the Earth. They developed that into the Gemini program, two-man capsule. They then went to Apollo, and then they moved on from there to Skylab, orbiting Earth, to the Space Shuttle, and to the International Space Station. All of those have something in common with one exception, and the exception is Apollo. Every other mission, Mercury, Gemini, Skylab, Shuttle, Space Station, are in low Earth orbit. Apollo isn't. Apollo is the only major space program that's questioned because of where it went, allegedly. All right, well, let's carry on and see what they told us about it. This is Apollo 11. This is Buzz Aldrin exiting the lunar lander, known as the Eagle, photographed by Neil Armstrong. And here he is, coming out backwards through his hatch. If you go to the Science Museum in London, you can see the Apollo 10 lunar lander. It's on display in the Science Museum along with a piece of moon rock, which you know is moon rock, by the way, because it says on the label, moon rock. There's no question about that, is there? Somebody had the bright idea of measuring the size of this doorway. It's 32 inches square. Then they went along and measured a spacesuit and found it was 32 inches deep. So he's got a bit of a tight squeeze coming out, but he obviously did it. This is the circular argument that's used quite often because, well, we've got the photographs on the moon, therefore they must have got there. No, that doesn't add up. Anyway, out he comes, feet first, can't see where he's going. He's going to walk down this ladder. Okay, so down he comes. And Neil Armstrong's obviously got bored stiff watching him come down because he decides to photograph the rubbish bag underneath. He had to photograph various aspects of the Apollo craft because they wanted to make sure that the rocket exhaust here hadn't been damaged when it landed and everything was in order, which is fair enough. That's what you'd expect to happen. Don't forget, Buzz Aldrin is still trying to get down the ladder and Neil Armstrong's not helping him. And then they photographed one of the pads to make sure it wasn't damaged. And one little point here, there's obviously a lot of dust was blown up by the exhaust as it came down onto the lunar surface. This rocket that lowered it onto the lunar surface is about the same power as a Harrier jump jet, and when that lands, it blows everything everywhere. But on the moon, there's no atmosphere, so it can't blow anything anywhere, can it? No, well, it didn't blow anything anywhere because there is no dust showing in any of the landers' pads here. Funny that. Oh well, back to Neil and Buzz, and here he comes down the ladder. Think about this picture for a minute. You're going, allegedly, to a place you've never been to before, in an atmosphere that doesn't exist, wearing a spacesuit which is heavy and cumbersome. You can't see where your feet are. Would you really kick your left foot out like that when your right foot is not even on the ladder? I don't think so. You might do that when you've done it 100 times during your training and simulation exercises, just to prove to the guys photographing you that you can have a bit of a laugh as well. Anyway, down the ladder. Yep. Beautiful pictures, aren't they, by the way? Absolutely wonderful. Well lit, well focused, well framed. No viewfinder. Don't forget, no viewfinder. A bit further down, yeah, he's about to get off the ladder, or is he about to get up the ladder? It's hard to tell. Now, in the time I've been speaking, since we looked at the first photograph, is the time it took him to do it. 3 minutes. So in 3 minutes, Neil Armstrong, who was operating the camera, could focus on different distances, top of the ladder, bottom of the ladder, underneath the spacecraft. He could set different exposures in shadow, in bright sunlight. He could do all this without cutting Buzz's head off, without getting the camera off center. He could do all that in 3 minutes without doing a second shot of any of it. That is what does not make sense. Now, we'll look at those 8 photographs in sequence there. Those are the pictures. If you go onto the NASA website, those are the reference numbers for each of those 8 photographs. They were taken in sequence in 3 minutes. According... No, they were taken on Kodak Ektachrome transparency material, which cannot be altered in the process. It's transparency material. Now, if you're used to digital cameras, this may all sound a bit old hat and old-fashioned and very 20th century, but this is what they used. They used transparency material. Once you develop it, that's it. You can't change it. You can take prints off it, which is what they've done, and you can change those prints, but it will start to show up. Just to go back to the first photograph again, it's not often been identified that there was a flag on the moon or before they got out, reflected in the triangular window of the lunar lander. I don't know if it's real or not, because they hadn't put the flag up at this point. They were both together to do the flag. Moving on then to dear Buzz coming down the ladder. His foot is not on the rung. There is a highlight of light on the heel. He's sticking his left foot out. The soles of his feet are very well illuminated. Where's that light coming from? Ah, I know, some bright spark will say. It's reflecting off the lunar surface. Really? That's not the way light works. The lunar surface directly behind him is in shadow, as we'll see later. It's reflecting off Neil Armstrong. He's wearing a white spacesuit. No, not big enough. A highlight of light produced like that is produced by a point source of light i.e. an electronic flash. Simple. It's what they used during the training exercises, when they would then debrief everybody. It's what you do in a training exercise. You film it, you photograph it, and then you all sit down and say, oh, you got that right. Well, that was very good. You don't want to do that again. You fall over. That's debriefing. Nothing secret about any of that happening. Okay. Where did this light come from? Where did these highlights come from? You can see how much dark area there is. This is overexposed, yes, but not seriously overexposed. Kodak Ektachrome film, which I've actually used professionally, is a very good film, but it has a very low tolerance for exposure latitude. You've got to get the exposure right, or you're in serious trouble. You've got to then photograph it again. A normal professional practice is what's called bracketing. You set what you think is the correct exposure with your exposure meter, which they didn't have on the moon, and you take a photograph slightly overexposed or slightly underexposed and hope that you'll get it absolutely spot on. And then, to be doubly sure, you take lots and lots and lots of pictures of the same subject to make sure you've got the composition right and the focus right, because film is the cheapest thing you're going to have on the moon. But they didn't do any of that. There was no bracketing. There was no additional photographs. It's as if they didn't care. One small step, one footprint on the moon. Iconic photograph. How did they take it? How did they take that photograph on the moon?
The camera was here.
Right, the camera was on chest, mounted on the chest. A Hasselblad camera has the nearest you can focus it is about 3 feet. So you take it off the chest, and you point it at your foot, and you take one photograph. No, that is not the way it works. It's beautifully exposed. It's right in the center. You're seeing exactly what you expect to see. That was taken here on Earth under controlled studio conditions. And if anybody can prove me wrong, I'd love to hear it. For 20 years, I have asked that question. Please prove me wrong. I'm still waiting. American flag. There it is. It's up. Stuck in the ground. There are no moving flags. They weren't that stupid. The only time you'll see the flag waving or moving is when somebody's touching it, putting it into the ground. Now, we have a mystery in this photograph. I wonder if you can spot it. It's the one-legged astronaut. Where are the other footprints? It's going one way, but it's not going the other. Bit of a mystery, that one. Now, this photograph here shows both astronauts on the lunar surface at the same time. That's fine. We'll come to another photograph that shows 2 astronauts on the lunar surface that isn't fine. This was taken from what's called the data acquisition camera, mounted in the spacecraft, that was filmed at 1 frame per second the whole time they're on the lunar surface. And what they're doing is putting the flag up. Okay, they put the flag up, but where's the light source? They're both astronauts of about the same height, about 6 foot. Why is one of their shadows nearly 50% longer than the other? If the light source is the sun, which is a long way away. Now, I'm not saying that there is a light source nearer than that. It's just that I don't know what the answer is. Anybody have a clue as to what the answer might be? I'd be interested to hear it. Because the sun should cast the same length shadow on 2 people, but it doesn't. The angles are different. And also, the angles here, it's 25 degrees and 35 degrees. We're told that at the time of Apollo 11 landing, the sun was at about 13 degrees above the horizon. That's fair enough. It gives good shadow definition. But not in this picture. So there are these inconsistencies between the official story and what we see. Okay. Here we have Buzz Aldrin and the solar wind collector. It's just a strip of aluminium foil. And how come it's so beautifully illuminated on the back and there is a shadow off the pole? Buzz Aldrin isn't standing close enough to do that. And what are all these things here? This is likely to be lens flare. That's the shape of a Hasselblad shutter. What's this? And why is this area here almost illuminated? Maybe it is illuminated. But there's no explanation for that. How far away would you say the horizon is on the moon? We're in a flat part of the moon, the Sea of Tranquility, which is where they allegedly landed. How far away is the horizon on the moon? And the answer is about 2 miles, just slightly less than 2 miles. Do the trigonometry, it's a circular body, you're standing 5 foot above the surface, 5, 6 foot, how far can... Does that look 2 miles away? And there's quite a lot of fall-off of light. We'll not get into too much detail on the fall-off of light. But we will look at this iconic photograph. It's the only one that was ever taken, beautifully framed. He almost got his head cut off, but not quite. How far away is the horizon? Is it really 2 miles away? He's standing in a pool of light. That's what it appears to be. The shadow is what you expect it to be, but how come you can see every detail in his spacesuit which is in shadow? On the moon, it's very bright light or it's very dark. Shadows get very dark. You can see the top of his helmet. It's all filled in, that technical expression, filled in. You fill light in because the human eye can see much more contrast than a camera, not a digital camera. That photographs things completely differently to film camera. A film needs additional, that's why film cameras have flash guns on them to give the additional light. This, you notice he's not wearing a camera, by the way. They only had one camera on the lunar surface for Apollo 11. They had two in the spacecraft, but they only used one. And it's called Magazine 40. There's 121 images on that. You can go and check them on the NASA website. You will see every photograph that they took. They're all in focus, except the last two, I think it is. So this photograph here, taken under controlled studio lighting conditions here on Earth, as were all the others. It's actually been altered. This is the official image with just on the top of the head, and this is the image you're more likely to have seen with a nice bit of black at the top so it balances the photograph out. When I first started looking at this whole Apollo anomalies, this was one of the only images I could find. I bought it at an astronomy show in London. That was before the internet existed. And this is the sort of thing you had to get hold of. And that's where it all started. Because you can see where it's been added in. That's the original, which is a bit light. Just a tiny bit light. Again, a bit of a pointer to something weird going on. Now, we'll move on to Apollo 12. And this is a similar picture to Al Bean coming down the ladder, photographed by Conrad. But when you examine the photograph, this is what you find. That it's been manipulated, it's been changed, it's been altered. Not very well. Maybe they thought nobody would ever bother to do a high contrast comparison. But what's all this? It's as if somebody has tried to black it out. All right, still on Apollo 12. We have another sequence of 8 photographs, again taken in sequence. Photographing the genome. This is the little thing they put on the ground that gave an indication as to the color rendition. And they take another one there. Oh, look, astronaut, take a picture of him. Oh, bored. Take another picture of the genome, back again. Oh, here he is again. Now, on all those photographs, you would have to change the focus, the exposure, and get the composition right. They've done it brilliantly, absolutely brilliantly. And there are no duplicate photographs, there are no overexposed photographs, there are no heads cut off. How did they do that with no viewfinder and having to manually set the exposure, the aperture, and the focus? And none of them are known photographers. Al Bean is quite a well-known painter nowadays. This is a close-up. You can see the photographer. The trouble is his hand isn't actually close enough to the camera to have pressed the shutter button, but never mind. And you'll notice that here you're looking down on top of the camera. No viewfinder, you know. And you can see all the where's all this light coming from? Light doesn't just appear, it has to be directed. So if that astronaut standing there on level ground in front of him is taking the picture, how come this camera is pointing at the ground?
It was psychic, man.
It's what?
It was psychic.
Yeah, maybe. Anyway. Again, in more detail of the close-up of the image, which we've covered, there we have another one. This is the second photograph, and you'll notice in the helmet here are the, I don't know what they are. Are they reflectors? Are they spotlights? Are they, what are they? Anybody got any ideas? Because they're what? Possibly, yeah. Well, obviously, you know, some UFOs were flying over saying, what the hell's going on here? They didn't ask permission. Again, in more detail, showing just how mysterious some of these photographs actually are. And then if you look actually at the detail here, remember I mentioned the crosshairs. These are the crosshairs here. And cross there. And there are some at the top which are obviously not visible because if they're on black background, they're not going to show up very much. But they do show up. It's as if it's a double exposure. Those crosshairs should not be there. They're far too close together. This is where it should be. So I don't know what's going on with that one. Yeah, any more than I know what's going on with this one. Weird. This is Apollo 12. This is Surveyor 3, the unmanned craft that landed on the moon. It just demonstrates it's quite possible to land unmanned craft on the moon, and we'll come back to why that's relevant later. This is one of the great mysterious photographs of all time. Photographs don't work like this. Right, this is Apollo 14, Antares. That's the sun there. This is the lunar surface, allegedly, and this is the shadow cast by the spacecraft. So where's all the light coming from that is illuminating the shadow side of the spacecraft? If there's nothing on the moon to reflect sufficient light, because to photograph the directly illuminated surface here as clearly as the totally dark shadow area here, you would need as much light reflected back into it as you have got on here. It's simple optics. There's nothing simple there. That is a fake. And just looking in detail at these crosshairs, it's as if there are two images coming on here. You've got one correct crosshair and one distorted crosshair, as if the film wasn't correctly in register when they faked it. Moving on to Apollo 15, I mentioned the highest mountain on the lunar surface. That is Mount Hadley, this one here. This is Mount Hadley Delta, hence the strange symbol, which is just a little bit shorter. It's 13,500 feet high. No, it doesn't sound very high. It's above the lunar surface, and I don't know what point it was measured, but let's say it was measured above here. If you get the US Geological Survey maps, which you can find on the internet as well, they give you all the various heights. Okay. So let's say it's about 6,000 feet above the surface here. This mountain here is about 6,000 feet above that. And this is what it looks like from ground level. This is Apollo 15, and there we have the lander and the rover and Irwin, and this is Mount Hadley Delta in the background. Okay, it's about 7 miles away. Go back to here, this distance here is about 7 miles. I mention that because it's relevant to what we're going to see next. Notice also the variation in the lunar surface here compared to the variation, the rather bland version that we've got here, and the very clearly defined line between the two. And also note how beautifully the American flag is illuminated in dark shadow. Again, they're very good at illuminating things in dark shadow with no additional light source. Just as a point of comparison, Mount Everest, haven't been up it, a bit cold, but Mount Everest here, Mount Everest Base Camp here is about 7 miles distance, the same as in that previous photograph of Apollo 15. It's also about the same height, Mount Everest, 29,000 feet, Everest Base Camp at 19,000 feet, similar height above the viewpoint. Does it look like it? This should be a similar photograph. It looks like Snowdon's little sister, that one. It's tiny. This is what it should look like, and reasonable. Now here we have a bit of a mystery. This is Apollo 15. These are consecutive photographs. Note the numbers. 11863 and 11864. I actually double-checked that on the NASA website to make sure I got the numbers right. So, Scott here, Dave Scott, photographed by Irwin. Here's Irwin. Scott has got a camera on here. Irwin hasn't. How did Irwin take the photograph of Scott? There's only one camera. Did he put it on the ground? And why hasn't he got it here? It's just, basically, it doesn't add up. The lunar rover, lunar lander moves about all over the place. Similar point, these are photographs, different photographs, same point on the photograph. There's the lunar lander. What's it doing over here? And how come there are two of them? Weird. Craters come and go. This got filled in before this photograph was taken. Obviously, the set builders were pretty busy. And no, I'm not going to get involved in the sea rock. Anybody know what the sea rock is? It's a rock with a big letter C on it, which appears in Apollo 16 photographs. Now, where was the lunar rover? Lunar rover here, little trucks about the size of a Ford Escort, maybe a little bit smaller, made by Boeing, but it couldn't fly. It could drive around. It cost about £5 million each, and they just drove it for a day and left it there. Where was it stowed on the lander? Now, this is the lunar lander. This is a photograph taken in the assembly. There's the ladder down which the astronauts are going to walk. There's the ladder there. It's the hatch. There's the ladder down there. That's the port side, so-called because that is when you're looking out of it, which they do. They look out through the windows up on there. The port is on your left, starboard's on your right. So it appears to be loaded on the left-hand side, the port side. So why is that empty and why is it there? It's just a bit of a mystery. It may well be that they hadn't unloaded it. So what's that doing? I don't know. Again, an inconsistency with the official story. Right, here's one for the astronomers present. I want an answer to this, please. This is the Apollo 17 landing site. There in the picture is the command module that's just separated from the lunar lander, which is about to land, and it will orbit the moon twice, and it will land about there. Okay. There's the horizon here, long way away. It's about 60 miles above the lunar surface. So where's the terminator? The terminator, not Arnie, the terminator is the point where sunlight and darkness meet on any circular body. This is Apollo 11, photographed, and this is not a shadow, this is just one of the thrusters. That's a terminator, that's the picture you expect to see. So where is the terminator here? The shadow lengths are very similar. Terminator should be around here, but there's nothing on there. Now, when a lot of these images were taken, NASA was using a large model of the lunar surface, constructed from a lot of the photographs taken by the lunar orbiter, not the lunar reconnaissance orbiter, that comes later. The lunar orbiter unmanned craft photographed the lunar surface trying to find somewhere to land. And they did very good photographs, up to about 3-foot resolution, which is better than they managed for the next 40-odd years. And they built a model of the moon. And they photographed that model. There's nothing secret about it. They filmed it as well, so that when the astronauts got into their landing simulators, they could project onto the screens outside the windows what it looked like as they approached the moon. It's what any simulator will do. You know, you can simulate landing a plane at Heathrow, and it looks like Heathrow, but it's all screens around the pilot. Same on the lunar lander. They had a model, they photographed it, they filmed it. Who is to say that that isn't a picture of this model? And they forgot the terminator. You start looking in detail at some of these photographs, Apollo 17, this one, and you'll see that there appears to be cutouts and strange background interference. You shouldn't get that sort of interference. I know these are digital images, so you'll get pixels. But these are scanned images from the original transparencies, we're told. And that's probably Earth, though it's hard to tell. Now, think about this for a minute. You're on somewhere you've never been before. You're wearing a spacesuit, which is bloody uncomfortable. Could be a bit hot and difficult. You've got a camera that's got no viewfinder, and you've got to work out the exposure and the composition. And you've got to get 3 objects lined up. You've got to get your mate, Schmidt. You've got to get the American flag, obviously. And you've got to get Earth to show where you are, i.e. not on Earth. And you've got to get them lined up exactly right. Now, I'll tell you what. I've tried to recreate that photograph. And after about 20 attempts, I just gave up. It was almost impossible to get the 3 lined up, correctly exposed, correctly focused, with no viewfinder. Come on, guys, don't mess us about. We're intelligent enough to be able to work these things out. It's the only photograph taken. There was no other image taken in case the first one was wrong. How did they know they'd lined the moon up if they'd got a viewfinder? Apollo 17. The valley here is about 5-6 miles across. That is a fault on the image. It's not anything special. Now, in that picture is the lunar lander. Where is it? It is there. Before we find out where it is, let's have a look at what happens if you extend the contrast. You get this weird image on the back, on the sky. Why doesn't it extend all the way down? Now, you may well have heard the story about Kubrick and the front projection images and how he was supposedly involved. I don't think he was involved with Apollo. He may well have been technical consultant because he was filming 2001: A Space Odyssey just before Apollo 11. And incidentally, his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick, died before the premiere. But he specifically requested that the premiere of his last film, Eyes Wide Shut, was to be held on July the 19th, 1999, precisely 30 years after the landing of Apollo 11. Coincidence? Possibly. I don't know. Was Kubrick involved? I don't know. What I do know is that front screen projection, which is what he used in Apollo in 2001 and has been used by many filmmakers since then, produces that sort of artifact in the background. It's, as the name implies, screen. It's a huge cinema screen, in effect, a reflective screen. It's made by 3M's company. And it has lots and lots of little beads which reflect light. That's what it's supposed to do, rather like this screen here. This reflects light. If you put enough of them in the background, you get that sort of artifact, which may be why some people have been slightly confused and consider that there are structures on the lunar surface, which they only see in that sort of artifact. I don't know. Now, moving on. Similar picture, here we come to Apollo 17, but let's just find out where that flipping, there it is, lander. It's up there. Go back. You can't see it until you enlarge it sufficiently for it to pop up, and there it is. Tiny. Okay, just to make sure it is there. There it is. Oh, you've got to get really close to see it. This is what a telephoto lens image would look like. The previous photograph wasn't taken with a telephoto lens. Now, assuming that that is where the lander actually landed, what's it doing over here? Now, explain this. These A here, A, these, it's the same feature in each photograph. D is the same feature. It's a little mound. B are these little craters here, and E is this little dark area here. It's basically just to show that it's looking in the same general direction. So we have here, on the first photograph we looked at, the lunar lander miles away. I mean, from this viewpoint, the lander is about 4 or 5 miles, 3 miles away, which is about right for the type of image you've got. You've got to get pretty close to see it. So if you take another photograph with the same feature in it, what's the lander doing there? That doesn't make sense. Ditto here. Same feature, different time of day because you've got more. They were on the surface for about 3 days, and the sun will move a certain distance in that, so the shadows will change. But these just don't add up. These just don't make sense. These are anomalies, as is this. Similar feature, B over here, the little crater, E, the little mound. Big mountain here, lander here. Whoops, where's he gone? Oh, it's here. Here we are. There's the crater. It didn't move. We were not told it moved once it was on the lunar surface. And it's disappeared again. It bounces around, this lander. Disappeared. You couldn't get the rover onto the lunar surface without the lander, because it carried it there. So where's it gone? Disappeared. Again, consecutive photographs here. One of them this was taken earlier here, and the footprints are here, but not here, which is weird. And then there's that genome that looks at the color image. How did they put it there? There are no footprints anywhere near. Perhaps they threw it or dropped it. Because you see, footprints do appear on the lunar surface quite distinctly. You get quite a lot of footprints. No wheel tracks. Funny that. We're told it weighed about 450 pounds on Earth, which would make it weighing about 80, 90 pounds on the lunar surface. Enough to produce a wheel track, I would have thought, and they're very keen to show us the wheel tracks, as we'll see later, but they don't appear on here. And then no wheel tracks. Plenty of footprints, no wheel tracks. Did they drop it there? You can say it's been moved, there's dust in the wheel here. Did they kick it in, or what happened? It's an anomaly, it's an inconsistency, it's unexplained detail, which is, the more you look at these things, the more you get. Oh dear, here we go again. This is the fake photograph of Apollo 14. Spin the thing round so you've got the flag over here. It's exactly the same image, just reversed. And then this photograph, coming up now, appeared in Alan Shepard's biography called Moonshot. Alan Shepard is most famous for having taken a golf club onto the lunar surface and hit a golf ball with it. And guess what? You can see the golf ball. If you've ever watched golf on television, yes, you can see golf balls flying through the air head on. You can't see them going across because they move too fast and they're quite small. Here's Alan Shepard. Here's Ed Mitchell. Here's the craft. Oh, the flag. They've moved it. Because if you recall, it was right alongside the lander. There's a checkerboard thing here. So the question I asked originally was, who took this photograph? Because there were only ever 2 astronauts on the lunar surface at any one time. We saw one on Apollo 11, and the photograph was taken on a cine camera. No, this is a Hasselblad photograph. There are crosshairs. Not very clear, but they are there. There are crosshairs. This is a composite of 5 separate images. It was in Alan Shepard's book, and it wasn't described as a composite. This photograph, blown up to about that size, was on display at the Kennedy Space Center until we made the point to NASA. It said, well, we know this is a composite because no 2 astronauts were ever photographed together. So why are you showing a composite? Why are you showing a fake photograph? They took it down then. But they wouldn't admit that it was a fake. They did say that there was one image here, another image was here, the spacecraft was a 3rd image, the flag was a separate image, and these were all painted on. Sorry? Coming to that, there's the video image. Notice the flag is different, but it's a similar composition. That's where they got the idea from, obviously, but they didn't get it right. Either they're too arrogant to think anybody is going to notice, or too above everything to consider that anything they do would ever be questioned. And even if it is questioned, as NASA said in response to David Percy's questions, quite legitimate questions when filmed on Sky Television, his response to many of the questions was, we don't have enough time for this claptrap. That's where NASA's coming from. Well, if you're a National Academy of Space Actors, I suppose you probably wouldn't. And then the moon rock, of course, don't forget the moon rock, because that proves we went to the moon, doesn't it? Moon rock proves we went there. The Russians, not questioning it, prove we went there. And the reflectors left on the moon, at which we fire giant lasers, prove we went there. No, it doesn't. The Rijksmuseum thought it was a big joke and kept it. It's a piece of petrified wood. Nobody told us they had petrified wood on the moon. If you saw this original, would you believe that this would commemorate the visit of 3 astronauts on their world tour to the Netherlands, presenting the Dutch government with a piece of moon rock? Yes, you would. And then when you find that the whole thing is a complete fake, and you laugh about it, and NASA chose not to respond. Ah, I hear you say, but we know they landed on the moon because, look, we photographed the landing sites. Oh, wow. Oh, genius. Oh, this is so good. God, I'm pleased. I can forget it all now and go home and shut up and do something more interesting. No. They still haven't stopped faking things. It's Apollo 12. Remember we saw the Surveyor 3 here? If I sound a little sarcastic and a little bit cynical, it's because I am. I make no excuse for it. The Intrepid, that's the lander. These are the various craters that they named for various reasons, and you can see very, very, very faintly boot marks, or because they didn't have a lunar rover at this stage. They only had themselves, so they walked everywhere. But you can see these. Okay, boot marks. Now, I don't know if anybody is familiar with a guy in Australia called Jarrah White, who produces under the name of Moonfaker, so you can guess where he's coming from. Very, very interesting videos looking at a lot of the evidence. He's taken up the mantle of Ralph Renee and Bill Casing and working on proving that NASA basically lied to us a lot of the time. And he's had a look at a lot of these lunar reconnaissance orbiter photographs and can demonstrate fairly conclusively that many of them are faked and manipulated. He's actually a filmmaker himself, so he knows what to look for in digital images. These are digital images. This isn't. This is one of the very first photographs taken by, oh no, hang on, we've gone too far, back again. This is Copernicus crater in the center of the moon. And it's what you expect to see. It was taken on by the lunar orbiter. Very confusing. Lunar orbiter. And it shows the Copernicus crater, which to me looks more like an open cast coal mine than an impact crater. We're told it's an impact crater by alleged astronomers who appear to know what they're talking about. I don't think they do. This is not an impact crater. Impact craters are completely different. There are impact craters on the moon. We've got a couple here on Earth. The most famous is Meteor Crater in Arizona. It's saucer-shaped. You get a body traveling very fast, impacting a solid object like the Earth. It makes an impact crater, which is, the diameter is 8 times the depth. That's 60 miles wide and 3 miles deep. It's not an impact crater. It's got a flat floor. This is more likely to be an electrical discharge crater. We'll not get into the detail of thunderbolts and electrical discharges which are recorded throughout history, but that is more what it looks like. Now,
what distance is that?
Sorry?
What distance would that last picture be at?
What distance above the surface?
Yeah.
30 miles.
30 miles.
Yeah.
So if the lander was in that picture, you'd clearly see it.
You'll probably be able to see it,
Yeah.
but not very clearly.
Clearer than the ones that have shown us that, I suppose.
Not necessarily, because they weren't trying to show a close-up. Right, this is the one unexplained photograph that's never ever been photographed again. Vitello crater, bottom left-hand corner of the moon, taken by Lunar Orbiter 5. If you just Google rolling rocks on the moon, this is what you'll get. It's a tiny detail of a much larger image, but it shows quite distinctly a track and another track here with an object at the end of the track. Apparently, this object is about 75 foot across. This is about 25 foot across. I don't know what they are. I know what I think they look like, but let's call them rocks for the moment. When NASA were asked to explain this photograph, they said, they are rocks dislodged by moonquakes. Right. That was their explanation. That's the official explanation, which just shows where NASA's coming from, basically, never a straight answer. So why didn't it dislodge these rocks? And these ones, and these ones, and there's lots of rocks. And how come this one rolled up out of a crater about 800 foot across the lunar surface, and this one about 1,200 foot across the lunar surface. And if you examine the photograph in more detail and slightly other areas, there are another 3 rocks leaving similar tracks. Vitello crater. It's never been rephotographed. Whatever you think it is, I don't know what the answer is, but I think it would justify further investigation. Okay, I think we've seen enough for the moment. Let's just have a look at pale blue planet, or the blue marble. Now, whenever you see a photograph of the Earth, this is the photograph you normally see. And you can always tell it because there's a little triangle of cloud above the Sudan. It's the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, Africa, Madagascar, Antarctica, Australia over here somewhere, Britain up here somewhere. It's a great photograph. I don't know if it was taken by Apollo 8, which is what's claimed. It could have been. Could have been taken by a geosynchronous satellite 22,000 miles out, which is where your sky channels come from. Whatever it is, they don't seem to have been able to improve on it since that was photographed. Now, there are 3 objections to what I've been saying today. The Russians would have blown the whistle. They got the rocks, I mentioned that, and they had the reflectors. So, of course, they got to the moon. Because if they hadn't, the Russians would know. This is the point. The Russians, when asked, are you sending man to the moon? They said, we're going to do our best. And they had the rockets to do it, the N-1 rocket they were intending to go to the moon with. They told Bernard Lovell, as he was then, Sir Bernard as he is now, head of Jodrell Bank Telescope, who was helping the Russians track their craft, which is nice. And he said to them, when are you sending a man to the moon? They said, when we can ensure his safe return due to the dangers of radiation. The Russians knew about it. So why didn't they blow the whistles on the Americans? They were generous. Thought, well, the Americans are prepared to take higher risks than we are. Okay, possibly. They never attempted anything else, but they'd been ahead of the Americans. They got the first man in space, the first woman in space, the first to the moon, Mars, first to Venus. They were very good at space travel. So why didn't the Russians blow the whistle? Because their political system is so different from ours that who would have blown the whistle? Who in Russia would have said, excuse me, you're faking it? Only the president of the Soviet Union would have done. That was Brezhnev. You get into the politics of it, and the whole politics of Apollo are quite interesting. We're not going into too much detail other than to say that the Russians were being supplied by America with wheat, millions of tons of wheat. There'd been a drought, there'd been a crop failure in Russia. America are generous people. They supplied it. Would Russia have blown the whistle and cut their supply of wheat off? I don't know. So why didn't the scientists? Why did no scientist in Britain come forward? Why does it take me to point out these things? Why haven't the physicists, why haven't the scientists, the biologists, the astronomers, the astrobiologists, all these ologists, why didn't they come forward and say, look, I think there's something a little bit not quite right here? Because they'd probably lost their job. I haven't got a job to lose. I'm self-employed, doesn't matter. Recently, since the opening up of the Soviet Union, a lot of Soviet scientists have been able to examine the Apollo record. And some very interesting papers are coming out of Russia now. One of which says that the Saturn V rocket, as described, was not powerful enough to lift the payload we are told it lifted to the lunar surface, 46 tons. Was not powerful enough to do it. It could have lifted 28 tons. The way you determine that is the speed of travel as it takes off. You can read all about it. I'll give you the website at the end. There were several reports of a faked re-entry of the Apollo 15 craft being pushed out of a big aircraft. It was seen over the Pacific. The command module, the thing they landed in on the end of the parachutes, the command module, appears to be too light. Now, you can tell how much something weighs when you put it in water, and you know the dimensions of it. You can calculate how much water it displaces which will give you the weight, and it appears to have been too light to have done everything that we were told that it did. The Apollo 15 photographs have been examined by Russian cinematographers and scientists, and they have determined that the parallax shown of a photograph that should have been, that one we showed up there, shows that there was some distant photograph being taken, that the parallax was wrong. It appears that the photograph was not several kilometers away, a little mountain several kilometers away, it was just a few hundred meters away. The Mythbusters show, where they prove conclusively that hoax believers were complete fruitcakes and should be shut up at once, because of course they landed, of course they did everything they said. Russian scientists have taken that show, Russian cinematographers have taken that show and tried to recreate it to prove one way or the other what they're saying is correct. And the only way they could recreate, the Russians could recreate the Mythbusters show was by faking it, by adding in additional lights to give the impact. Now the Russians were quite honest. They said, this is what we did, this is what we tried to do, this is what we actually achieved. You can see it on YouTube. The Russians are starting to look at Apollo, and the Russians are saying we find problems with it. Okay, there are other objections. How can you keep 400,000 people quiet? How do you keep a secret? 400,000 people worked on Apollo during the 1960s. How do you keep 400,000 people quiet? Easy, the same way you did on the Manhattan Project and the D-Day landings. You make it a matter of national security and national importance, and people will go along with that. I'm not saying 400,000 people knew about this. No, they didn't. Maybe 30 or 40 at the most would have known about it. But secrets can be kept. Radiation. I thought, okay, radiation in space is dangerous to man. You know, you get too much of it, you tend to fry and produce weird offspring, and it's not a good thing to get a lot of radiation. But the guys who went to the moon were protected from the radiation. So I thought, hey, this is good. So I wrote to NASA and said, you know, these spacesuits you made for the astronauts that went into space and protected them from the radiation, could they be used to go into Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and clear up the radiation? No, they said. I actually wrote to the manufacturers, a company called Hamilton Standard, who were part of the International Latex Group who make bras. That's why they made fitted costumes. And they said, you better address your question to NASA. Still waiting. Temperature in space on the moon, minus 150 degrees centigrade, which is about twice as cold as anywhere here on Earth. The coldest temperature on Earth is about minus 80 in Siberia and in Antarctica. Very cold indeed. On the moon, plus 120 centigrade, which is more than the boiling point of water. So how come batteries could survive that temperature variation? They weren't anything other than standard batteries. Batteries tend to go when it's too cold. The vacuum of space is not a good area to work in. So you've got to take your own atmosphere with you. So you have a spacesuit to keep your blood from boiling. You've got to be pressurized. Try using a 5 pound per square inch pressurized gauntlet. It's not easy. I know people who've attempted it. So how come nobody's blown the whistle on all this? Well, they have. A lot of people have. We sell a book on the Nexus stand called Dark Moon by David Percy, who's done a lot of research into this, 8 years of research. His father-in-law worked for NASA and said, look, just look at the Apollo record. And along with David, I have to agree with his conclusion that the Apollo record is seriously flawed. If you find that you agree with this, fine. If you don't agree with me, come and explain why. But in the meantime, I would thank you very much indeed for your attention. And that is the website I'd recommend looking at, ourlist.com and nasa.gov. Thank you. I'm at astronaut 4 on this one. Thank you very much. Great. Okay.
Let's take questions or anything. You've got time to...
We've got time. Oh, we've got time for questions. I'm expecting lots. Oh, here we go. Now I can see you. Yes, sir.
I was just wondering your opinion on the documentary as something funny happened on the way to the moon.
That's Bart Sibrel. Is that Bart Sibrel's?
I've just watched the documentary, but they've got the footage there of recreating
The Earth through the window.
what's your opinion on it?
Bad piece of filmmaking. I mean, they didn't, you'd think with all the resources behind them, they could have at least got that right.
So, do you agree it's part of the fake?
Yeah, I do. It appears fake. There's also another interesting sequence in Apollo 13, the actual Apollo 13. I haven't mentioned Apollo 13, well, maybe I will. Apollo 13, where you see these poor shivering in space, shivering astronauts, sitting in the lunar lander, waiting to go around the moon to come back to Earth. And the window is blue. The triangular window of the spacecraft. Now, I thought space was black. The only thing blue in space is Earth. Were they in low Earth orbit all the time? Apollo 13, I mentioned David Percy's book, Dark Moon. Why is it called Dark Moon? Because if Apollo 13 had landed where it was supposed to land, when it was supposed to land, that particular part of the moon was in darkness. So was Apollo 13 just a complete fabrication? It appears so. Because if it hadn't had the exploding oxygen thing, how did that explode? You think they got the quality control right. Who was it who said that, we're really in danger here? NASA has put out to tender all the rockets and spacecraft to the lowest bidder. Well, what do they expect? Exploding oxygen tanks. Apollo 13 appears to be rather more mysterious than the Tom Hanks movie would show. There are a lot of questions about that, which it could be a talk in itself. No questions? Yes, sir.
This is just an observation. I'm just watching your pictures there. I noticed that all these satellite dishes, not satellite dishes, dishes to transmit the stick back to Earth. How many cables are these?
Right.
I've looked into that. I'm just...
What? Is it fair to say the question is, how do they transmit the photographs back to Earth?
Well, no, I mean, the dishes there, what are they for? Is the web to transmit things of radio communications or the live pictures? There's no actual cables to the dish. So,
Right. There were cables in some of the images, on the Apollo 11 images, there were electric cables or cables on the ground. They were linking the video camera to the spacecraft. And then we were told there was live video transmission from the moon. Right, the question has always been, how much bandwidth did they need to do it, and how much battery power was required to send those pictures back in real time? Because that's what we were told we were watching, real-time pictures. Which seems highly unlikely, because the only way they could generate it was with batteries. And I know they had hydrogen fuel cells, but was there enough battery power? And that has always been a question that nobody's ever actually got to the answer, so I don't know the answer to that. But I did say that we'd talk about the reflectors, and very briefly, we're continually being shown pictures of these lasers that fire up to the moon, and then we get a reflector back so we can tell how far away the moon is. The first time that was done was 1996, just after David Percy had interviewed the head of the astronomy place in Arizona that was supposed to do it. And they realized they hadn't done it, so they started doing it when he started asking questions. Now, the point about those lasers being fired at the moon is, we know a laser is very thin, very thin, very thin, but when it goes 250,000 miles, how wide is the beam when it gets to the moon? And the answer is 2 kilometers. It's wide. It's not a straight beam all the way to the moon. So when it gets to the moon, it's quite wide. It bounces back. So how wide is it when it gets to Earth, and how much of those laser photons get back to Earth? And what size dish do you need to receive them on? 6 photons of light, apparently. The point about reflectors is you don't need a reflector to reflect anything off the moon. People were bouncing radar signals off the moon in the late 1950s. It was a very secure form of radio communication. You could bounce radio signals off the moon.
Yeah, but that's radio.
Yeah. The problem with that is,
They did the same with the laser knife.
all I'm saying is that you can bounce it off.
Lesser.
Hmm?
With a lesser beam.
Yeah.
Bounced it with a lesser beam than what we've got now. 957 off the moon. That's another thing that you know, they said that they bounced it off the reflector on the moon that the Apollo 11 put down. But they were doing it way before that in the 50s. Without any reflectors.
Yeah.
Without a beam as strong. I think it was 1,000 times less than the beam that they're doing now.
Yeah. So there are certainly a lot of. That's a good point. Thank you for that. And also bear in mind that Yuri Gagarin wasn't the first man to orbit the Earth. Yeah, there were 8 others who died. They were brave, you know, and we know that because their communication was being listened into by 2 Italian brothers in Milan who were ham radio operators, and they rigged up something to listen into this strange communication, and they heard women's voices in space. They had one spacecraft that literally went off to orbit the sun. The Russians never actually fronted up to it until quite recently. They have now. So Gagarin wasn't the first up there. He was the propaganda version. There's a lot of propaganda in those, and that's what it was all about. It was propaganda. Look, America don't have the option of coming second to anybody. They'll use whoever they can find to help them. We've seen Ben Ainslie doing it recently. We've seen Werner von Braun. He was German. He helped them. Charlie Chaplin helped with the film business. It doesn't mean to say that America have failed. It means that they have the ability to use as many people as is necessary to achieve their objective. And that's what they did. They achieved their objective of demonstrating to the world, we are good. Our system is the best. Fine. I'm not arguing with that. But at least let's get some truth about what happened. So if anybody can help get the truth out, wow, that's what we're here for. Yeah. Yep. There's a lot of things like that. I mean, if you want to get into the subject of the moon, you know, is it artificial? Is it hollow? Is that where UFOs come from? Come around the back. Why does it keep one face towards us at all times? Oh, the UFO can go around the back. I think.
So just one last question from
Yep. Yeah. Right. When the lunar lander takes off from the lunar surface, it's videoed. How did they pan up to follow it? Good point. Practice. The camera was operated from Houston. This is the official story. Operated from Houston. I forget the name of the camera operator, but he had to start the upward pan. It was about a second and a third delay, time delay. Yeah, because of the distance between the Earth and the Moon, there's a time delay because light travels at whatever it's been, 300,000 kilometers a second. Quite fast, but there's still over that distance, there's a delay. So they had to practice the upward pan. The point about that particular image is that when it takes off, when the lunar lander takes off to go up to join the orbiting command module, it's firing a rocket. Right, the rocket is using the same fuel, which I won't attempt to pronounce, but it's an oxidizer and a fuel. When the two are brought together, it explodes. And that's why it works so well, because it doesn't need moving parts. It's just pressurized. But it's the same fuel as the space shuttle. And when you see the space shuttle maneuvering systems working, getting the space shuttle into position, they're filmed quite regularly, you see flashes of light every time the rocket is fired. This is still in space, low Earth orbit, 250 miles up. But on the moon, you see nothing. You see no light, you see no image, you see no... Is it just being shot up on a bungee rope? Because that's what it appears to. Is it a model? We don't know. We've got no scale to... Some of the images, I'm pretty sure, are models, especially the ones of the lunar rover in action. That appears to be a radio-controlled model. So you've got all these odd things, but we want to believe it. There are a lot of people I know who get quite upset when you start deconstructing Apollo. And there are many, many questions like that which you can bring up and say, okay, you know, why this, why that? People get upset because it's part of their nature to believe in something as iconic, that word again, something as iconic as Apollo, voted the top TV moment of the 20th century. One small step. That image we've all got of dear Neil, going down the ladder, black and white image, fuzzy, talking to the president. I mean, it's a brilliant production. I'll give it that. It's a brilliant production. But did it happen the way we were told? I don't know. That's what we're here for.